Hello and welcome to Indus News live from Islamabad. I'm Meher Sher and these are the headlines. France and Germany have imposed a second national lockdown after a record spike in COVID-19 cases. India reported 517 deaths overnight, with the death toll crossing 120,000. The country's total number of infections has crossed 8 million. In Pakistan, the virus has claimed 16 lives overnight, with the death toll rising to 6,775. Globally, 1.17 million people have lost their lives to the virus, while nearly 44.5 million have been infected. The US and the Taliban have discussed implementation and violations of the Doha Agreement. Taliban spokesperson Naeem Wardak said a delegation led by Mullah Baradar Akhund met US envoy Zalmay Khalilzad and NATO Commander General Scott Miller. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Wang Wenbin says the United States is trying to stoke confrontation in the world. He was responding to U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's accusations that China has brought lawlessness to Sri Lanka and Maldives. China has already warned Pompeo against sowing discord among Asian countries as he visits Indian Ocean islands. In Vietnam, at least 25 people have been killed as Typhoon Molave thrashed the country's coastline. Around 40 others are missing in landslides triggered by torrential rains from the typhoon. Well, those were the headlines. More news in detail after a short break. Stay. Welcome back. And now the news in more detail. France and Germany have imposed a second national lockdown after a record spike in COVID-19 cases. India reported 517 deaths overnight, with the death toll crossing 120,000. The country's total number of infections has crossed 8 million. Globally, 1.17 million people have lost their lives to the virus, while nearly 44.5 million have been infected. More in the following report.
The surging cases in the second wave of COVID-19 pandemic have wiped out months of gains. Europe and the United States are particularly being battered by the second coming of the virus. A new wave of curbs has swept through Europe, resembling the blanket lockdowns earlier in spring. France, Italy, Germany, Poland, and many other European nations have been registering record daily cases. While the only hope out of this whirlpool is a cure, the delivery of potential vaccines is likely only from April next year.
In best case scenarios, we could see monthly deliveries of about 20 to 15 million doses of vaccines. The moment the first companies start to signal that they are on the road, the big numbers of supplies are due to start in April.
Over in Asia, too, India's top laboratories say their trials of Russian Sputnik V vaccine are expected to be concluded only by March 2021. China and South Korea, two countries that handle the virus best, are also witnessing a spike in new COVID-19 cases. Meanwhile, the pandemic is now hitting Russia's far-off regions as the country sends army doctors to fight the virus in the Ural Mountains.
We are not talking about the second wave of the pandemic, but as we have discussed just this morning, some regions are facing the first wave now, according to experts. We have to monitor the situation closely and react in time and efficiently.
In Latin America, Mexico has surpassed 90,000 confirmed deaths just a day after it crossed 900,000 infections.
And moving on, Pakistan has registered 16 more deaths from COVID-19 overnight, pushing the toll to 6,775. The health ministry says 908 people have tested positive for the virus in the last 24 hours. The ministry said there are 11,695 active cases in the country. It added 624 COVID-19 patients across the country are in a critical condition. It said out of over 331,000, more than 312,000 people have recovered so far. Meanwhile, the National Command and Operations Center has made it mandatory to wear face masks at public spaces. It said all commercial areas, including shopping malls and restaurants, will be shut by 10 p.m. local time. Now, the Taliban say they have discussed the implementation of the Doha deal with the U.S. This comes after both parties accused each other of violating the pact last week. Taliban spokesperson says Mullah Baradar Akhund-led delegation met U.S. envoy Zalmay Khalilzad and NATO commander General Scott Miller. He said the two sides discussed release of remaining prisoners. The spokesperson said they also mulled over the reasons for the increase in violence. He said the removal of Taliban members from the blacklist was also brought up. He said violating any provisions of the Doha Pact will not lead us in a good direction. Now, China says the United States is trying to stoke confrontation and division in the world. This comes after U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo accused China of bringing lawlessness to Sri Lanka and Maldives. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin said the trend of peace and cooperation is irresistible in the modern world. In a press briefing, he said Pompeo's lies and smears cannot erase the fact that China is committed to a win-win cooperation. China has already warned Pompeo against sowing discord among Asian countries as he visits the Indian Ocean islands. Moving on, the U.S. has ruled out talks over a technical solution of Turkey's procurement of Russian S-400 missile defense system. U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Military and Political Affairs Clark Cooper says Turkey will have to abandon its plans of operationalizing S-400 if it wants the fifth-generation NATO F-35 jets. Addressing a virtual event, he said the U.S. has given multiple options to Turkey to meet the requirements to ensure their air defense. Moving on, Muslims all over the globe are outraged at French President Emmanuel Macron's remarks against Islam. Protests were held in Iran and Palestine, calling for the French president to apologize and withdraw his remarks. More in the following report.
Anger is spreading in Muslim-majority countries at France's decision to continue publishing blasphemous cartoons. Angry Iranian protesters burned posters of French President Emmanuel Macron and called for a boycott of French goods. Iran's leadership has backed the public sentiment, calling on the Western countries to change their course.
I'm hopeful that those who have made a mistake in this direction will at the soonest make amends for their mistake and return to the path of justice, morality, and respect for the beliefs of all the heavenly religions that exist in this world. Those religions must be respected.
Over in Palestine's West Bank, Muslims and Christians joined hands in protest against the blasphemous remarks by Macron. Speaking to join protest, Greek Orthodox Archbishop Attila Hanna said the caricatures are insult to all religions.
From the Nativity Church area, our message as Palestinian Christians and Muslims is that we deplore the insults against Islam and at the same time we deplore satire of religions and religious figures. Palestine's message, Bethlehem's message, Jerusalem's message, the message from this holy land to the world was always and will always be a message of love, brotherhood and humanity.
Demonstrations were also staged in Bangladesh's capital Dhaka, where about 40,000 people gathered.
Moving on, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas has called on the UN to hold urgent talks for an international peace conference. In a letter to UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, Abbas urged him to coordinate with the Quartet on the Middle East. Abbas said the conference will help pave the way for a serious peace process based on international law. He said the conference should put an end to Israel's occupation and help Palestinians achieve their freedom. Earlier, the UN Security Council convened a virtual open debate on current developments in the Middle East. The Saudi-led coalition in Yemen says it has destroyed 6 drones launched by the Houthi rebels. Coalition spokesman Turki al-Maliki said the explosives-laden drones targeted Saudi civilian facilities. He said the coalition forces are taking steps to ensure people remain safe from rebel attacks. This comes just a day after the coalition destroyed 3 ballistic missiles fired toward Saudi cities of Jazan, Najran, and Khamis Mushayt. Moving on, Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro has accused Spain of helping an opposition member, Leopoldo Lopez, flee the country. In a press conference, Maduro said the Spanish ambassador to Venezuela, Jesus Silva, will be expelled over his involvement in the affair. Lopez, who fled to Spain on Sunday, stayed at Silva's residence after escaping from house arrest. Meanwhile, Maduro revealed that Venezuela's Amuay oil refinery was targeted by a powerful weapon in a terrorist attack. He added Venezuela has gasoline reserves equivalent to 20 days of consumption.
Yesterday, the Amuay refinery was attacked with a powerful weapon, a powerful long weapon that we are investigating to determine what type of weapon it was, one of the most important refineries in Venezuela and Latin America. They wanted to cause a total explosion at the Amuay refinery. They demolished a tower with a level of thickness in steel that is superior to a war tank.
The U.S. has warned American citizens in the UAE and Saudi Arabia against potential terror attacks. In a statement, the U.S. Embassy in Dubai said it has reports that terrorist groups can attack its citizens and interests. It asked Americans in the region to remain alert. The U.S. Embassy in the Saudi capital Riyadh also warned American citizens of the possibility of missile or drone attacks. This coincides with an escalation of attacks by Yemen's Houthi rebels against the kingdom. And moving on, in Vietnam, at least 25 people have been killed as Typhoon Molave thrashed the Southeast Asian country's coastline. Around 40 others are missing in landslides triggered by torrential rains from the typhoon. The landslides, which hit remote areas in the central province of Quang Nam, killed 13. State media said 12 fishermen died at sea. The government says it has deployed hundreds of soldiers and heavy machinery to search for the survivors. In a statement, Deputy Prime Minister Trinh Dinh Dong said bad weather was hampering rescue efforts. The typhoon has left millions of people without electricity and damaged 56,000 houses so far. Molave has weakened to a tropical depression after making landfall and is expected to reach Laos later today. And in the U.S., Hurricane ZETA has slammed the state of Louisiana with winds of up to 175 kilometers per hour, bashing the Gulf Coast up to Mississippi. Officials forecast life-threatening conditions as a 55-year-old man died after being electrocuted by a downed power line. The storm left 875,000 customers without electricity in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. U.S. National Hurricane Center says ZETA's winds made it a strong Category 2 storm. It said rain of 2 to 4 inches is expected from the Gulf Coast to the Central Appalachians. Louisiana's Governor John Bell Edwards has urged residents to take shelter, promising immediate rescue and recovery aid. The Trump administration has declared an emergency, providing additional federal resources to Louisiana. We'll be back with more news after a short break. Stay with us. Welcome back. And now moving on, in Warsaw, thousands took to the streets for the 7th day against a court ruling that further limits Poland's abortion laws. Police warned demonstrators not to target churches again after some services were disrupted and buildings defaced in an earlier protest. After marching through the center of the Polish capital, protesters stopped outside the parliament. Last week, the top court ruled that abortion due to fetal abnormalities was not permissible under the Constitution. Demonstrators blamed the nationalist government of Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki for the verdict. More protests are planned across Poland later this week. And in Yemen, conflicts, climate change, and the weak economic growth are leaving more people without enough to eat. The coronavirus pandemic has contributed to make the situation even worse. More in the following report.
The United Nations warns nearly 100,000 children are at risk of dying in Yemen due to malnutrition that has increased about 10% in 2020. The country is approaching a dire food security crisis. The UN observes that cases of children with severe acute malnutrition are rising at alarming rates.
We are receiving many malnutrition patients and seeing many deaths caused by the poor economic conditions and the inability of parents to come to the hospitals because of the economic conditions.
The UN describes this as the world's largest humanitarian crisis, with 80% of the population reliant on humanitarian aid.
We call upon the United Nations to break the siege for our children and so that we can live in peace. Our children are dying and falling ill and they have done nothing wrong. The whole world is conspiring against Yemen and against us and our children.
Despite a difficult operating environment, humanitarians continue to work across Yemen. According to a report, if acute malnutrition is left untreated, around 20 to 30% of children will die each year.
Hotels in Cuba are turning to urban agriculture to attract tourists after COVID-19 brought the industry to a halt. More in the following report.
Some 30 hotels in Cuba's top beach resort of Veradero started receiving foreign tourists once again after 7 months of quarantine. They are growing fresh herbs and vegetables on site, hoping they will act as a draw and entice guests to stay. Here they grow radishes, green beans, basil, corn and mint among other plants that are then used in dishes and cocktails in restaurants and bars.
We use these herbs, mainly aromatic herbs, which go from the garden to our kitchens and our...
And now on to business. Most shares in Asia Pacific have declined following an overnight plunge on Wall Street as COVID-19 forced national lockdowns. The Kospi in South Korea fell close to 1%. Shares of Samsung Electronics declined around 2% after the firm predicted a fourth quarter decline in profits. In Hong Kong, the Hang Seng Index declined nearly 1%. Over in Japan, the Nikkei 225 and the Topix Index shed marginally. In mainland China, Shanghai Composite gained close to 0.5%, while the Shenzhen component rose nearly 1%. Meanwhile, stocks in Australia also saw sizable losses as the ASX 200 dropped close to 2%. And moving on, U.S. plane maker Boeing says it will cut 7,000 jobs after suffering a $3.5 billion loss in the third quarter of the year. In an address to workers, Boeing CEO David Calhoun says the company wants to have 130,000 staff by the end of 2021. He said they are aligning the company to market realities and carefully making staffing decisions. Earlier, Boeing targeted a 10% cut to its staff, which stood at 160,000 people at the start of the year. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news.